So in order to understand fetal circulation, we're going to utilize two diagrams, and we are going to start with this first one over here. Now, the fetus is growing in a fluid-filled environment in the womb of a female. So since it's growing in that fluid-filled environment, the lungs and other various organs of the fetus will not yet be fully functional, and the fetus will rely on the mother for oxygenated blood, nutrients, and then the transportation out of deoxygenated blood. So the process all begins with this vascularized organ referred to as the placenta. Now, the placenta is attached to the fetus via the umbilical cord. Now, the umbilical cord houses umbilical arteries and umbilical veins, which are responsible for transporting nutrients and gases from the mother to the fetus. Now, let's do a recap of what is an artery and what is a vein. An artery carries blood away from the heart, so artery away. And an umbilical vein, a vein carries blood towards the heart, so it does the opposite. So when we talk about the umbilical vein, it's going to go towards the heart, and it's going to be carrying oxygenated blood because it's carrying the blood from the placenta, which is being oxygenated by the mother. So the umbilical vein is carrying oxygenated blood from the placenta, and it's going to move towards the heart. But as it's going towards the heart, it's going to first go towards the liver, which is a structure right over here. Now, in normal human circulation, we go towards the liver to detoxify blood before it is pumped through the heart into the rest of the body. But here, the liver of the fetus is not yet fully functional. Also, the blood that the fetus is receiving right now has already been detoxified by the mother. So there is no point for the blood to go to the liver, and most of that blood will actually bypass the liver through a special duct, and that duct is known as ductus venosus. So the oxygenated blood that was carried through the umbilical vein will bypass the liver through the ductus venosus, and it will go towards the heart through the inferior vena cava. Now, in normal human blood circulation, we know that when blood enters through the inferior vena cava, it will then enter the right atrium. Now, in regular human heart circulation, when you're in the right atrium, the blood, you go towards the right ventricle, and then you're pumped through and you go to the pulmonary artery and you go to the lungs to get oxygenated. But in this case, this blood has already been oxygenated by the mother, so it doesn't even need to go to the lungs, and the lungs aren't even functional yet. So there is no point in going to the right atrium and then to the pulmonary artery to the lungs. So what that blood is going to do, it's going to bypass the right atrium and it's going to go directly to the left, it's going to bypass the right ventricle and it's going to go to the left atrium. So from the inferior vena cava, it goes to the right atrium, then it's going to bypass to the left atrium. But how does it bypass that left atrium? It's going to do so through a small opening over here that is referred to as the foramen ovale. So blood passes through, and now we're in the left atrium. Now we're going to be pumped into the left ventricle. And from the left ventricle, that blood is going to be pumped up and out through the aorta to the rest of the body. Now, we have to talk about the deoxygenated blood for a second. So most of the blood in a fetus, that oxygenated blood, is going towards the developing fetal brain. So the fetal brain will then have deoxygenated blood that is going to come back down. Well, we know that blood that comes from the upper extremities of even a human goes through the superior vena cava. And that's exactly what's going to happen. So any blood that's coming from the upper portion of the fetus, especially that brain region, is going to enter through the superior vena cava and enter that right atrium. Now, once again, we know that deoxygenated blood that's coming, it's going to enter the right atrium, it's going to want to go to the right ventricle, and then it's going to want to be pumped to the lungs. But remember, the lungs aren't fully functional yet. So what do we have to do to that deoxygenated blood? We have to send it back to the mother, aka we have to send it back to the placenta. So there's no point in going to the lungs. So how are we going to bypass the lungs? How is that deoxygenated blood going to bypass the lungs? So that deoxygenated blood that enters the right atrium is going to go into the right ventricle. But instead of being pumped to the lungs, it is going to enter the aorta. But how does it enter the aorta? It does so through another opening referred to as ductus arteriosus. So ductus arteriosus allows that deoxygenated blood to enter the aorta and then be pumped down, and then eventually it is going to reach an umbilical artery, which is going to carry blood away from the heart and into the placenta. Now, you may be wondering, the aorta is pumping out oxygenated blood that was coming from the mother, and it's also pumping out deoxygenated blood that came from the brain and the upper extremities of the fetus. That is true. The descending aorta is going to be pumping out both deoxygenated and oxygenated blood, so we're going to see some mixing of that blood, and as a result, we get partially oxygenated blood that is traveling through the fetal body. So it's not fully oxygenated. That's a key distinction that we need to know. Now let's move down to this other diagram over here, where we can actually see in color coding what's happening. So remember, when the blood came in, it's coming through an umbilical vein because we're going towards the heart, so we're utilizing a vein. We're going to bypass the liver because the liver is not fully functional yet. The blood has already been detoxified by the mother. We bypass through the ductus venosus, and we enter through the inferior vena cava, also known as the ascending vena cava, into the right atrium. Now, we're in the right atrium, but there's no point in going to the right ventricle because we've already been oxygenated. So we're going to bypass the right ventricle and enter the left atrium via an opening over here referred to as the foramen ovale. Once we're in the left atrium, we enter the left ventricle, and then we are pumped out through the aorta, and we go to the rest of the body. But when we talk about that deoxygenated blood coming from the head, arms, those upper extremities, that deoxygenated blood is going to come through the superior vena cava, also known as the descending vena cava, into the right atrium. And now notice over here that we don't see much mixing of blood at this point of that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. That mixing happens over here once it's pumped out through the aorta. In the right atrium, we don't see much mixing at this point. So that deoxygenated blood, it will go into the right ventricle, but instead of going to the lungs to get oxygenated, it is pumped out through the aorta, and once again, we have a special opening, and it's called ductus arteriosus. And that is essentially fetal blood circulation. Some key openings that we need to know are ductus arteriosus, foramen ovale, and ductus venosus.